everybody. I'm Claire Beresford, your host and the CEO of Lawrence Simons, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our latest episode of Summing Up, the legal podcast. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this Summing Up podcast provides fresh insights to help leaders in the legal industry prepare for and navigate the rapidly changing and evolving business landscape. Today, I am joined by the incredible Jelena Madir. Jelena is a recognised global leader and academic who comes from a background in banking and finance. She now leads at Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, as their general counsel, supporting their mission to leave no country behind on immunisation programmes and ensure equitable and sustainable use of vaccines worldwide. She has won numerous accolades throughout her impressive career, including the General Counsel Legal 500 Power List, Women in FinTech Power List, the American Law Attorney of the Year 2021, and Law.com's Innovative Leader 2020. Alongside her role as General Counsel at Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, Jelena lectures at the University of London and the Geneva Graduate Institute, helping to inspire and raise a new generation of industry leaders. She also sits on the board of the Nordic Investment Bank and NEFCO, the Nordic Green Bank, and manages to find time to give back and volunteer as an advisory board member of the Global Impact FinTech Forum. Wow. Jelena, that is quite an impressive CV. So if I may, if we could start right at the beginning, what was home for you growing up?
I grew up in Split, which is the second largest city in Croatia, located on the Adriatic coast. I was an only child. Both my parents were economists and very appreciative of the value of learning and education. Because Croatia is a small country with quite significant influence of Italy in the south and Austria in the north, we were all encouraged to study languages relatively early on. So I grew up watching Italian TV, spending my summers in language schools in Italy. And we also studied German at school, which is quite an important language in Croatia, given that Austrians and Germans are quite significant investors. And of course, English. So at the time, I had pen pals in the US, and we were exchanging letters, which I appreciate is a very antiquated concept in this day and age. So when I was 14, I visited them in the US, and that experience awakened my strong desire to go study in the US. And so I applied for and was accepted in an exchange program in the US in upstate New York, my senior year of high school, ended up staying for university and then law school, given that law can only be studied as a 3-year graduate degree in the US.
Wow, that's quite the path. Could you perhaps share with us who are listening or watching, was there a particular moment or a particular catalyst that for you exploring to become a lawyer, to take that legal education path?
Yes, realizing I was not very good at math and was unlikely to get admitted to a good business school, given that half of the business school admissions test consisted of numerical reasoning, whereas the law school admissions test is all verbal reasoning, which I was much better at. So when I went to university at Dartmouth in New Hampshire, I thought I would study economics like both my parents, but it turned out I was not sufficiently good at math. So I ended up studying political science and Asian studies with Chinese. And so towards the end of my university studies, I was debating between business school and law school. And again, because math had never been my forte, the choice became quite clear. And since I wasn't going to business school, I thought the next closest thing would be to become a commercial lawyer. I ended up going to Columbia Law School in New York, which had a very good corporate law program and a lot of practical courses, including contract drafting, deals workshops, practical clinics, and I took pretty much all of those practical courses.
Interesting. I think we can attest there's probably some of people in our audience who have found that sort of maths or math is, as you say, route quite a challenging one. And it's interesting. We're going to talk a little bit later about sort of some of that board work, but it is important for lawyers to be able to understand numbers. I would say that, and I think probably in your background you'll be able to share a little bit more about that. But it's interesting you mentioned sort of that route and that path in, and you've had a mix of both private practice and in-house legal experience. What has inspired you to remain in-house as the general counsel at Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance? And maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that role involves.
So, I spent first 5 years of my career in big US law firms before I transitioned in-house. First at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD in London, and then as the GC of Gavi. And I've really found that working in-house allows you to really develop in-depth knowledge about the organization to a greater degree than is often possible for private practice lawyers. And this is because as an in-house lawyer, you can really become closely involved in one organization by supporting a whole range of its activities and developments over a period of time, and really see how your legal input contributes to meeting those business objectives and protecting the organization's assets and interests. So my role consists of a wide range of day-to-day more mundane type of work, ranging from insurance procurement and employment on the one hand, all the way to contractual arrangements with the private sector, and other international organizations, governments, disputes, both in courts and or in arbitration and employment related disputes, then the issuance of bonds, so treasury related operations, so whole gamut of issues. By contrast, private practice lawyers will be advising a range of different organizations, so most likely in relation to a particular area of expertise, be it intellectual property, litigation, or specific transactions. But then on the flip side, being part of a company's in-house legal team can often have its limitations with a flatter structure and less room for progression. And it could also mean that you lose your narrow speciality and client base. So I think one should really think about those aspects before moving in-house. I'd also say that in the US, we see a lot of movement between the in-house world and private practice world, as well as between public and private sector. And I really hope we'll start seeing a bit more of that in Europe.
It's interesting because there are many. It's like anything in life, isn't it? That there are pros and cons on both sides, and we see it at Lawrence Simons. Partners in private practice that are fulfilled and are, really enjoying their expertise and the ability to help their clients, that those chief legal officers, those general counsels do what it is that they need to do. If I could just change gears a little bit, we in these Summing Up podcasts, we ask sort of legal leaders, of some of their views and experiences. And I don't want to ask you anything that you would feel not comfortable commenting on. But one of the things that we do see is that there's a pay disparity between private practice and in-house. Often those US law firms where you've got equity partners, they are commanding quite interesting drawings from their partnership, rightly so, because of the hours and the work that they're doing. But some recent studies have shown that there's a pay disparity between men and women within the legal profession. And without getting into any confidential information, but have you, or maybe any of your friends or colleagues, if you've been discussing this, have you ever faced any gender discrimination in your career?
So personally, I don't think there is overt discrimination, but I think there is probably quite a bit of unconscious bias, which we all experience. And that's why I think regular trainings on unconscious bias are really important. Through my experience, I have noticed that men are much better at advocating for themselves and asking for the likes of higher salary and a promotion. And as we know, if you don't ask, you don't get. So I think if you're a manager, you may need to think along the lines of, this very good male team member is asking for a promotion or raise. Would I inadvertently be creating inequities if I didn't at least consider an equally good female team member, assuming there is one, of course, but who hasn't expressly asked for a raise or a promotion? Another issue that I would flag is that if you do ask for a promotional salary increase, you have to make a business case for it and be able to articulate why you think you deserve it, which I generally and unfortunately see men be able to articulate better than women. So it's probably a skill that we women need to work on developing. And then finally, and this is a really tricky one, because the environment has probably not become quite accustomed yet to women strongly advocating for themselves, when you do advocate for yourself as a woman, that could occasionally be perceived as pushy and aggressive, which is really unfortunate. And I think we all have responsibility to catch ourselves in those moments and think, would I have the same reaction if this request came from a male colleague, or would I consider them to be driven and ambitious, and that being a positive attribute?
Absolutely, and I think it's interesting, isn't it, when you are a woman in a position of power, a female leader, it's often part of that progression has been sometimes the ability in some of those difficult and challenging moments to advocate for oneself, or to find and navigate some of that path. And one of the things we like to do on this podcast is to ask leaders for any advice that they could give for people who are perhaps more junior in their career, or are looking for that. And one question that I have for you is that if a younger person isn't seeing themselves reflected in some of the higher levels of the legal profession, is there any advice that you'd like to share for them?
Sure. So, first, I would say identify your strengths, build an expertise in an area, and work on your personal brand. By that, I mean establishing yourself as an expert and go to person in a particular area. And you could do this by working on complex projects in this area and volunteering to always take on more work in that area. You can do that by publishing papers, blogging, or speaking about it. And I think it's really good to invest time and effort in building your brand, both within and outside your organization. And that also helps you develop that self-confidence and raise visibility. And this is key because your work often doesn't speak for itself, unfortunately. You do need to speak about your work, present it in the right fora, and get attention for your contributions. In addition, I think we all need to appreciate that our career is our own responsibility, and you should certainly try to find a good mentor, but don't expect your manager or your organization to take care of your career development. You need to think about your career, figure out where you want to go, and then steer it in the right direction. And managing your career needs ongoing planning and effort, and it's worth spending time to shape it to the extent you can, of course. And then I would also say that one should certainly invest in building a strong professional network, because the greater the number of people that can vouch for you and your work, the better your chances for growth. And then finally, I would say another piece of advice would be willingness to reflect on feedback, even if you think it's harsh or unfair. Because if there is certain perception about you, whether you like it or not, that's the perception about you, and you should reflect on it and demonstrate improvement rather than push back and be defensive, which of course is so much easier said than done. But everyone gets negative feedback once in a while. And what sets you apart is that ability to show humility, take that negative feedback on board, because way too many people will get defensive and not take feedback on board. And that can hold you back.
All really helpful and constructive tips and advice there, Jelena. You mentioned about sort of getting a mentor, or seeking that out. Is that something that you have done in your career, or have you had moments in your career where you've received some of that feedback, some of that where it's actually been that game changer for you to be able to move forward?
Absolutely. I mean, I've had some wonderful mentors, particularly in the form of senior women who have supported me and vouched for me. And then, of course, I think there isn't a single person who doesn't get some negative feedback, which can seem upsetting at the time. But again, it's important to reflect on it and build that self-awareness and show improvement.
Right at the beginning, we were talking about your sort of academic route into the law, and you are quite unusual in terms of some of the leaders that we are speaking with, because you have a PhD in law. You are a doctor of law. Can I just ask why you chose to do that, and were there any barriers or any issues that you faced to get into that doctoral program?
So first of all, I have to say I really enjoy research and writing. And in 2015, I happened to have been working on a project of drafting new sanctions procedures for EBRD, which required me to do a lot of benchmarking with other organizations and prepare a paper for the board on why we should be adopting those specific procedures pretty much clause by clause. And then I thought that I could expand that 30-page analysis into a PhD thesis on sanctions regimes of multilateral development banks. And it also just so happened that University of Westminster in London was offering scholarships for its PhD program, and I applied and was admitted into the program. And this particular program allowed for a lot of flexibility because I didn't have to take any courses, but just work on my thesis with my supervisor. And I was fortunate that I was able to complete it in 4 years while working, which is really thanks to the fact that I was very clear about the topic. I had already done quite a bit of work on it, and I had a pretty clear idea about my hypotheses. And so my advice to anyone wanting to pursue a PhD in law is to really try to have as much clarity as you can about the topic that you want to write on. And also make sure there is enough material out there for you to be able to do your research. And one of the biggest obstacles I've seen candidates face is precisely that narrowing down of the topic, which needs to be sufficiently precise and focused, and also broad enough for there to be enough material out there to do research and produce something that offers a unique contribution to the academic world.
I'm sure that action of, going into that detail and into that depth on a subject matter that clearly you're passionate about, and your advice on being really clear about what you want your thesis to be on is something that we can see is shining through in your answer. Again, if I can just change gears a little bit, but there's a tenuous link in terms of, well, there's a very clear link in terms of that passion, but you're very modest in your responses when I was introducing you earlier, but you have recently won several awards. The Legal Business Awards, you won an award for the most transformative in-house team of the year, and you also won the Innovative Leader Award from Law.com. All of this, if I may say so, whilst navigating a global pandemic where the raison d'etre of your business was being actually sort of at the forefront of what we were seeing in terms of vaccination programs across the globe. What was your approach to building your new team at Gavi? Particularly also during a time when we are facing something unheard of in recent times in terms of the global pandemic that we all lived through 2 or 3 years ago.
So my approach to building a team was prioritizing recruitment, unsurprisingly. And I know it sounds obvious, but when you're really busy, recruitment sounds like an administrative afterthought. It's really important to get the right people and to get them as fast as possible, which means you need to make recruitment as much of a priority as anything else. And I would say we have a really good recruitment process at Gavi, which I think strikes the right balance between the rigor and objectivity on the one hand, and then allowing for that degree of flexibility in the process on the other hand. So I take it upon myself to review all CVs and cover letters, prepare a written test that reflects the work that the individual will be doing, marking it on an anonymous basis, and then having a panel interview where we ensure that all candidates are asked the same questions and that the panel marks responses in an objective way, while at the same time allowing for the interview to be conversational and a pleasant experience. And then I also put in a lot of effort into making sure new team members are adequately onboarded and supported. So, for example, I have one-on-one meetings with all of my direct reports on a weekly basis. We also have weekly team meetings. And all of this is extremely important, I would say, in today's hybrid work environment where we work remotely 2-3 days a week.
Is your team, it's an international team, is it not? So how was that from not only navigating pandemic, navigating hybrid working, navigating But from a culture perspective, were there things that you were able to ensure made it, feel as one team? Because if you weren't all in the same room, how did you achieve that?
So it's really interesting because we now have part of the team that works remotely from mostly London, and then part of the team that is in our headquarters in Geneva. And that I actually find even more challenging than the situation where we were all online because everyone was on equal footing. And those team meetings, which were at the time even more frequent than once a week, were really served as that social glue when people were feeling very isolated.
It's interesting. We've seen that shift that you're experiencing, where you've got this mix of, the hybrid working, some people working from home all of the time, some people are 2 days a week, 3 days a week in the office, and some people, because of their choices, choose to go into the office more. And we see that across businesses, about the leaders are still navigating how to keep that team structure, team sort of feeling, but also that there's a real understanding, particularly when you're recruiting new people in, which you were doing during the pandemic, of how do you onboard, how do you orientate, how do you do that. You're clearly doing something very well, because the accolades and the awards that you and your team have been given are some are peer nominated, so there is a lot that we can learn from you. One of the things that I think that we can learn from you is to have some courage in changing what we in our world call verticals or sectors. But you made the move from financial services into pharma, sort of healthcare. Now, both regulated. That is one thing that we can say that they both have, but they are very different industries and sectors. What was that move like for you, and how did you overcome the main challenges?
So I think it's an interesting question because at its core, Gavi is actually a financing institution, because on the one hand, we fundraise, which on the legal side entails not only relatively simple grant agreements, but also a range of financing instruments, including securitization of government pledges to issue bonds through our UK subsidiary, which is called International Finance Facility for Immunization. And then on the other hand, we fund a wide range of immunization programs through a range of implementing partners. So I would actually say my background in financing transactions has been very useful and relevant. I also think complex financing transactions make you a very precise and a structured drafter and writer, which is helpful for a wide range of commercial transactions. Probably, I would say, the most important skill for a lawyer. And then I would say that the bulk of what you do as a general counsel will concern contractual matters, and that skill is very transferable. Then you will be dealing with litigation, which in my case relates to contractual disputes and employment matters, which are again not sector specific. And so then that really leaves a small universe of sector specific issues and regulatory matters that are particular to the relevant industry, which I think you can learn relatively quickly.
You're being very modest. I think that what I think is also interesting are those what I call human skills. Some people call them soft skills, right? But it's that ability, I would imagine, that emotional intelligence that you also be able to have to read the room, to work out for one of your team how you would use a different approach for them than somebody else in your team that would respond differently to that. And I think that all links to what we're seeing within the legal profession, which is that mental health is a challenge for many people in the legal profession, as well as stress. And we had April, which was the Stress Awareness Month. May is Mental Health Awareness. We've had Mental Health Awareness Week here in the UK. And we've done some polling of this on some LinkedIn. And that, alongside other surveys, have found that 66% of respondents said that their legal career had been detrimental on their mental health, and a further 46% said that they were considering leaving the profession because of stress or burnout. Without without sharing anything that you don't wish to share, but do you have any advice for leaders who may be listening and wishing to help their team with mental health and well-being? And how important was that when you were doing the transformation for your legal team?
So first of all, I think it goes without saying that mental health has huge implications for workplace performance and employee experience. So it needs to be a top priority for every leader. And our regard for mental health of our team members has to be grounded in that genuine concern for them as human beings. And this is because if the organization has not actively promoted the culture of psychological safety, where people can feel safe to openly express themselves and discuss challenges that they may be facing, employees will not be willing to discuss their mental health issues, which ultimately has a big impact on employee satisfaction and productivity. And so now in terms of advice to leaders or my views on this, I think that as leaders, we need to acknowledge our own role in our team's mental health needs and psychological safety. We all know it can be extremely challenging to balance the demands and pressures of the workplace on the one hand and the mental health needs of our team members on the other hand. And at the end of the day, we need to create a compassionate, caring, and safe workplace culture that still prioritizes accountability and high standards, which is far from easy. And often, I think as leaders, we have to ask, what am I contributing to ensuring that we have the environment where everyone is able to succeed and we can deliver on our priorities while ensuring that we remain healthy? And to be sure that we are creating the right environment, I think it's important for us as leaders to regularly seek genuine feedback from our team members to make sure we're striking the right chord in how we're engaging, how we're leading the team, and that team members are getting the support that they need.
Very sage advice. If I may, I said right at the beginning that you are also you've got your busy career as your general counsel at Gavi, but you're also teaching at the University of London at the Geneva Graduate Institute. That takes quite some bandwidth to be able to do that, quite some ability to keep on going and to have resilience and the tools to look at stress perhaps differently. Are there any tips or advice that you could share about how you personally mitigate stress and maintain your mental fitness?
Well, Claire, ironically, I picked up teaching because I wanted to have other projects outside of work in order to be able to focus on something else and have to turn my mind to something else. Other than that, I'm a very sociable person, so it's very important to me personally to have a good network of friends that I can relax with after work and that we are also each other's support and source of advice in difficult and challenging times, which we all face.
Now, Jelena, your career is nowhere near over. But I ask this question. There's two questions that I ask of everybody when we're doing these things. But what's next? Right? Is there anything that you're currently doing that you can share with the team in terms of exciting projects at work, or is there anything in your academic professorship that you? What's next on your roadmap for you mentioned about how you have to be active in curating your career. It's your own responsibility. What does that look like for you?
So Gavi has had a very prominent role in the pandemic, as you said earlier. We were an administrator of the COVAX facility, which was the biggest program for the distribution of COVID vaccines in the world. And this involved negotiation of agreements with over 150 governments, with all key vaccine manufacturers and a host of complex financing arrangements. So unsurprisingly, we still have quite a bit of tail end work on that front, including some contentious work. And work related to the winding down of the COVAX facility, and then defining Gavi's role in the pandemic preparedness landscape. So we're looking at some new financing instruments that would allow us to have funding readily available when the next pandemic strikes. And we're also looking to design an instrument to incentivize manufacturing of vaccines in Africa. Now, one of the biggest challenges that we saw during the pandemic has been the fact that manufacturing facilities are predominantly concentrated in developed countries. And this has played into vaccine hoarding through the likes of export bans, and this has hindered equitable access. So clearly, there is a need to increase global manufacturing capacity and achieve greater geographical diversity so that all regions ultimately have access. Now, this, of course, sounds good in theory, but vaccine manufacturing facilities can cost more than $500 million to build. And it's not a viable business model if there is a chance that those facilities would sit idle in between crises. So what we're looking to do, we're looking at developing a mechanism which would give African manufacturers time-limited financial support to help them build their competitiveness for global vaccine tenders. Now, in terms of other projects, a few years ago, as I was developing a fintech regulatory practice at EBRD, I edited and co-authored a book titled Fintech Law and Regulation. And I'm now working on the third edition of this book together with about 35 incredible co-authors. And as you can appreciate, fintech is an incredibly fast moving area. So we have to update the book every 2 or so years, which is not an easy task, but it keeps me abreast of this exciting area. And then I continue teaching my distance learning courses on project finance, corporate governance and compliance, and fintech at the University of London.
Chapeau, madame. That is quite the ability to fill a day. Sometimes it's I get up and I'm like, I got up today. I'm clothed in my right mind. That is the thing for which I'm grateful. You clearly are working in a system and with a company that is doing good in the world. It is a wonderful thing to hear some of the things that you were mentioning about how we can ensure that there is much more equity across nations in terms of those vaccine programs. So I'm sure that there's a lot to keep you busy. And you mentioned when the next pandemic comes, which actually sent a shiver down my spine, because I was like, oh, but we do know. I mean, I think that science is telling us that there is going to be, at some point, there will be another pandemic for us to face, and it's companies like you and the work that you're doing that is allowing us to perhaps face that in a different way. So maybe we don't have a global pandemic. Maybe millions of people don't die. So that is a wonderful epitaph that you are bringing in terms of what you were achieving at Gavi. Finally, and this is always a lovely question, and we get many different answers to it. No, nothing is right or wrong, better or worse. But what is the one thing that you can't live without?
Oh my goodness, Claire, I would say the internet, but then the internet is only good with an iPhone and vice versa. So it would really have to be both.
And do you find yourself, are you an internet, an iPhone? Are you a scroller? Do you find that time passes in your evening? Are you quite disciplined in how you use the internet and your iPhone?
No, I'm on iPhone 24/7.
It's good to hear. We all have different habits with that. And do you use the internet in a way that is supporting? It's interesting, isn't it? If we think about your academic career and how you're teaching, when I was studying, we went to a library. We got a book out.
Here. Yeah.
We opened a book.
Yeah.
We then had to go and find another reference book. This reference. How are you using the internet in terms of your academic world?
Gosh, I mean, research is so much faster. But what was fascinating, I was just speaking to a colleague the other day, and she said, well, Google is considered outdated. It's ChatGPT these days. So that I didn't even register that. I need to become more conversant in ChatGPT.
Well, Jelena, thank you so much for your time today. We always appreciate getting thoughts, insights, and views from leaders such as yourself, and you've really helped us in this Summing Up podcast. So I thank you for that.
No, thank you for having me, Claire.